September 23rd, 1943, Cape Spear, Newfoundland. The fog came in at 0340 hours, thick and complete, reducing visibility to less than 20 meters. James Murphy stood in the lantern room of Cape Spear Lighthouse and watched the world disappear into white. He had been lighthouse keeper at Cape Spear for 31 years. He knew fog. The North Atlantic produced fog that could last hours or days. Fog so thick you couldn't see your hand at arm's length. This was that kind of fog. Murphy checked the foghorn mechanism and set it to automatic. One blast every 30 seconds, the standard warning pattern. Ships would hear it and know to stay clear of the rocky coastline. Murphy had done this routine hundreds of times. He went down to his quarters to make coffee. At 0520 hours, his radio crackled to life. Cape Spear Lighthouse, this is convoy SC-143, over. The voice was tense. Murphy grabbed the radio handset. SC-143, this is Cape Spear Lighthouse, James Murphy speaking. The voice identified itself as Captain Robert Harrison, Commodore of convoy SC-143, currently positioned 12 miles northeast of Cape Spear with 47 merchant ships. Harrison's situation was urgent. The convoy had been traveling through the night when the fog hit. Radio navigation was malfunctioning due to atmospheric interference. The convoy's position was approximate, based on dead reckoning, but not confirmed. Harrison knew there was a German minefield somewhere between his current position and the safe channel into St. John's Harbor. He had charts showing the minefield location, but the fog made visual navigation impossible, and his radio navigation was unreliable. Harrison asked Murphy if the lighthouse had better navigation equipment. Murphy said no, just a foghorn and a radio. Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Murphy a strange question. "How well do you know these waters?" Murphy said, "I've been here 31 years. I know every rock and current within 20 miles. Harrison said, "The minefield is approximately 8 miles northeast of your position. We need to navigate around it to reach the safe channel. Can you guide us using your foghorn?" Murphy understood what Harrison was asking. Use the foghorn as a navigation beacon. The ships could hear the horn and use the sound to maintain bearing relative to the lighthouse. But guiding 47 ships through a minefield in dense fog using only sound was something Murphy had never attempted. He said, "I can try, but you'll need to follow my instructions exactly." Harrison said, "We don't have another option. Tell me what to do." James Murphy was 58 years old and had spent more than half his life at Cape Spear Lighthouse. He came from a small fishing village on the southern coast of Newfoundland. His father had been a fisherman who died when Murphy was 16, drowned in a storm. Murphy became a lighthouse keeper because he wanted to help ships avoid the same fate. He married in 1915. His wife Anne bore 3 children. 2 died in infancy from illness. One son, Michael, survived and joined the Merchant Marine in 1939. Michael's ship was torpedoed in 1941. He was listed as missing, presumed dead. Murphy's wife Anne died in 1941 from pneumonia, 6 months after learning about Michael. Murphy had been alone at Cape Spear Lighthouse for 2 years. He maintained the light and the foghorn and the radio. He kept the lens clean and the mechanism oiled. He did his job because it was the only thing he knew how to do. Now, a convoy commodore was asking him to guide 47 ships through a minefield he couldn't see, using a foghorn and instructions given over a radio. Murphy thought about currents and wind and sound propagation in fog. He thought about the minefield location on the charts he had studied for years. He thought about 47 ships with thousands of men aboard who would die if they hit mines. He made a decision. He told Harrison to order all ships to reduce speed to 4 knots and maintain exact spacing of 300 meters between vessels. He told Harrison to establish radio communication with the lead ships of each column. Murphy would use the foghorn to provide directional guidance. 3 long blasts meant turn 10 degrees to port. 2 short blasts meant turn 10 degrees to starboard. 1 long blast meant hold current course. The ships would navigate by sound, adjusting their heading based on the foghorn signals relative to their position. The system was crude, but it was all they had. Harrison confirmed the instructions and ordered the convoy to slow to 4 knots. Murphy climbed to the foghorn controls and tested the pattern. 3 long blasts, 2 short blasts, 1 long blast. The sound carried through the fog, audible for miles. Murphy contacted Harrison on the radio and asked for the convoy's estimated position. Harrison gave coordinates based on dead reckoning. Murphy calculated. The convoy was approximately 11 miles northeast of Cape Spear. The minefield started 8 miles northeast of the Lighthouse and extended 4 miles north-south and 3 miles east-west. The safe channel into St. John's Harbour was west of the minefield. The convoy needed to navigate southwest around the minefield's northern edge, then turn south into the safe channel. Murphy told Harrison to steer the convoy on a heading of 220 degrees for 30 minutes. This would bring them west of the minefield's northern edge. Harrison ordered the convoy to the new heading. Murphy broadcast 1 long blast on the foghorn. Hold course. Every 5 minutes, Murphy asked Harrison for position updates based on speed and heading. Harrison's navigator calculated and reported. Murphy adjusted the instructions. At 0612 hours, Murphy calculated the convoy had cleared the minefield's northern edge. He told Harrison to turn to heading 180 degrees, due south toward the harbour. Murphy broadcast 3 long blasts, turn to port. The convoy turned south. For the next 3 hours, Murphy guided the convoy south through the fog, using only the foghorn and radio communication with Harrison. The process was slow and tense. Every 5 minutes, Murphy received position updates. Every 10 minutes, he broadcast new instructions. 3 long blasts for port turn, 2 short blasts for starboard turn, 1 long blast for hold course. The ships in the convoy strained to hear the foghorn through the dense fog and adjusted their heading based on the sound. At 0740 hours, a ship in the convoy reported they could hear waves breaking on rocks to their east. They were close to the coast. Too close. Murphy immediately broadcast 2 short blasts. Turn to starboard. The convoy adjusted course 10 degrees away from the coast. The sound of breaking waves faded. At 0823 hours, Harrison reported they could see the entrance to St. John's Harbour emerging from the fog ahead. The convoy was approaching the safe channel. Murphy had guided them southwest around the minefield, then south through the fog, then slightly west to avoid the coastal rocks, then back to the harbour entrance. 47 ships, 8 hours of navigation, 0 casualties. Harrison radioed Murphy. Cape Spear Lighthouse, convoy SC-143. We have visual on the harbour entrance. We're clear of the minefield. All ships accounted for. I don't know how you did that, but you saved this convoy. Murphy said, I just know the waters, Captain. Good sailing to you. The convoy entered St. John's Harbour at 0910 hours. All 47 merchant ships safely docked. Harrison filed a report with the Royal Canadian Navy describing how a lighthouse keeper had guided the convoy through a German minefield using foghorn signals. The RCN investigated. They interviewed Harrison and reviewed the navigation logs. They examined Murphy's method and concluded it had been effective, but not replicable under controlled conditions.
Too dependent on Murphy's specific knowledge of local waters and weather conditions. Too dependent on the convoy maintaining precise speed and heading. Too dependent on luck.
The RCN thanked Murphy for his assistance and filed the report. Murphy received a letter from the RCN 3 weeks later thanking him for his service to convoy SC-143. The letter did not mention awards or recognition, just thanks. Murphy put the letter in a drawer and went back to maintaining his lighthouse. He never told anyone about guiding the convoy. Who would he tell? He lived alone at Cape Spear. His only regular contact was the supply boat that brought provisions once a month and occasional radio communication with passing ships. He maintained the light and the foghorn and kept the mechanisms working. That was his job. The convoy guidance had been an anomaly, an unusual situation that required him to use knowledge he had accumulated over 31 years. That was all. In April 1945, the war in Europe ended. Murphy listened to the news on his radio and felt nothing in particular. The war had taken his son Michael in 1941. The war had indirectly taken his wife, Anne, who died of grief and illness 6 months later. The war ending didn't bring them back. Murphy continued his work at the Lighthouse. In 1946, the RCN decommissioned many temporary wartime facilities, but kept the lighthouse keeper positions because they served civilian maritime traffic. Murphy remained at Cape Spear. He was 61 years old and had nowhere else to go. In 1947, a merchant ship captain named William Chen visited Cape Spear Lighthouse. Chen had been the captain of one of the ships in convoy SC-143. His ship, the SS Northern Star, had been in the fourth column of the convoy formation. Chen remembered September 23, 1943, clearly. The dense fog, the fear of hitting mines, the foghorn signals that guided them through. Chen wanted to thank the lighthouse keeper personally. He found Murphy in the lantern room, cleaning the lens.
Chen introduced himself and explained he had been part of the convoy Murphy guided. Murphy said he remembered the convoy. Chen asked how Murphy had been able to navigate them through the Minefield blind. Murphy explained about knowing the currents and the wind patterns and the sound propagation in fog, about calculating position based on speed and heading, about using the foghorn as a directional beacon. Chen listened carefully. Then he asked a question that surprised Murphy. "Did you lose anyone in the war?" Murphy said yes, his son. Chen nodded. "I lost my brother," he said, "torpedoed in 1942. I think about him every time I cross the Atlantic. I think about how many men died in this war. And then I think about September 23rd, 1943, when 47 ships didn't die because you knew fog and current and sound. That matters." Murphy didn't know what to say. Chen thanked him again and left. Murphy stood in the lantern room and thought about Chen's words for a long time. He had spent 2 years after Anne's death believing his life had no particular value or purpose. He maintained the lighthouse because it was his job, and jobs needed to be done. But maybe Chen was right. Maybe guiding that convoy had mattered, not to Murphy personally, but to the men on those ships and their families. Murphy went back to cleaning the lens. The work needed to be done. In 1952, Murphy retired from Cape Spear Lighthouse at age 67. The Canadian government provided a small pension. Murphy moved to St. John's and lived in a boarding house for retired mariners. He spent his days walking around the harbour, watching ships come and go. He died in 1958 at age 73 from heart failure. His obituary in the St. John's Evening Telegram mentioned he had been lighthouse keeper at Cape Spear for 31 years and had served maritime traffic faithfully. The obituary was 3 sentences long. It did not mention convoy SC-143 or the Foghorn navigation or the 47 ships he guided through a minefield. Nobody remembered except the men who had been on those ships, and most of them didn't know the lighthouse keeper's name. In 1962, a German naval veteran named Klaus Bergmann was visiting St. John's on business. Bergmann had been a mine-laying specialist with the Kriegsmarine during the war.
He had helped lay the minefield northeast of Cape Spear in July 1943. The minefield was supposed to disrupt Allied convoy traffic approaching St. John's Harbour. After the war, Bergman became a civil engineer and worked on harbour construction projects. His work brought him to St. John's in 1962. While there, he visited the Maritime History Archive and read about convoy operations during the war. He came across a brief mention in a 1943 RCN report about convoy SC-143 navigating through the Cape Spear minefield in heavy fog with assistance from the lighthouse keeper. Bergman read the report carefully. His minefield. The one he had laid in July 1943. A convoy had navigated through it successfully in fog. He asked the archivist if there were more details about how the convoy accomplished this. The archivist found Harrison's original report describing Murphy's Foghorn navigation method. Bergman read it and sat very still for a long time. He had laid a minefield designed to kill merchant ships. A lighthouse keeper had guided 47 ships through his minefield using fog signals. 0 casualties. Bergman had spent 19 years believing his mine-laying work during the war had killed Allied sailors. He had carried guilt about this, even though he understood he was following orders and doing his duty. Now he learned that one of his minefields had been defeated by a civilian with a foghorn. Bergman asked the archivist if the lighthouse keeper was still alive. The archivist said Murphy had died in 1958. Bergman asked if Murphy had family. The archivist said not that the records showed. Murphy's wife and children had died during or before the war. He had been alone. Bergman left the archive and walked to Cape Spear Lighthouse. The lighthouse was still operational, now maintained by a different keeper. Bergman stood outside and looked at the building where Murphy had lived for 31 years. He thought about September 23rd, 1943. His mind's in the water. Murphy's Foghorn cutting through the fog, 47 ships navigating through based on sound. Murphy had defeated Bergman without knowing Bergman existed. Bergman had tried to kill men Murphy saved without knowing Murphy existed. The mathematics of war had put them in opposition. The mathematics of fog and sound had given Murphy the advantage. Bergman returned to Germany. He had no one to tell this story to. Murphy was dead. The war was 17 years past. Nobody cared about a minefield that failed to sink ships, or a lighthouse keeper who guided a convoy. But Bergman cared. He wrote a letter to the St. John's Evening Telegram describing what he had learned. The letter was published in November 1962. The letter explained that Bergman had laid the minefield, that he had recently learned how convoy SC-143 navigated through it, and that he wanted to posthumously acknowledge James Murphy's skill and dedication. The letter said, "I laid mines to sink ships. James Murphy used a foghorn to save them. His method was more effective than mine. I am glad I lost that engagement." The letter generated modest interest in St. John's. A few local historians researched Murphy's service. They confirmed the convoy SC-143 incident. They found Harrison's report and Chen's mention of visiting Murphy in 1947. They found Murphy's obituary from 1958. They assembled a small archive of documents about the lighthouse keeper who guided 47 ships through a minefield in fog. In 1965, the Canadian government posthumously awarded Murphy the Meritorious Service Medal for his assistance to convoy SC-143. There was no ceremony because Murphy had no living relatives to accept the medal. The medal was placed in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax with a small placard explaining what Murphy had done. In 1978, a Canadian documentary filmmaker named Sarah Mitchell made a short film about lighthouse keepers during World War II. The film included a segment about Murphy and convoy SC-143. Mitchell interviewed several surviving members of the convoy, including Captain Harrison, who was then 82 years old. Harrison described the fog
and the fear, and Murphy's calm voice on the radio giving instructions. Harrison said, "I commanded 47 ships that morning, but Murphy commanded me. He told me where to go and I went there, because he knew those waters and I didn't. He saved my convoy using a foghorn and 31 years of experience. I've thought about that many times. How much knowledge was contained in one lighthouse keeper that we almost lost because we didn't ask for his help. We got lucky that the fog was bad enough that I had to call him." Mitchell asked Harrison if he thought Murphy understood how significant his contribution was. Harrison said, "I don't think so. I wrote him several letters after the war thanking him. He wrote back once, very briefly, saying he was glad the convoy made it safely and that he was just doing what he knew how to do. He didn't see it as heroic. He saw it as practical. The convoy needed guidance. He had knowledge. He shared it. That was all." Mitchell's film was broadcast on CBC in 1979 and seen by approximately 80,000 people. It generated brief public interest in Murphy's story. Then the interest faded, and Murphy returned to being a footnote. The lesson from James Murphy's story is not primarily about navigation or seamanship or lighthouse keeping. It's about the value of local knowledge and experience accumulated over decades. Murphy knew the waters around Cape Spear in a way that no navigation manual or chart could capture. He knew how currents flowed in different wind conditions. He knew how fog affected sound propagation. He knew the precise location of rocks and channels. This knowledge had taken 31 years to accumulate. When convoy SC-143 encountered a situation that exceeded their technological capabilities, Murphy's accumulated knowledge became the decisive factor. The story is also about isolation and purpose. Murphy had spent 2 years after his wife's death believing his life lacked meaning. He maintained the lighthouse because it was his job. The convoy guidance didn't change this fundamentally. He continued maintaining the lighthouse the same way afterward. But William Chen's visit in 1947 suggested that Murphy's contribution had meaning to others, even if it didn't feel meaningful to Murphy himself. Sometimes the significance of what we do is more visible to others than to ourselves. Sometimes we perform essential services without recognizing them as essential because they feel routine or ordinary. Murphy guided 47 ships through a minefield using knowledge that felt ordinary to him because he had been accumulating it for 3 decades. To the 47 ship captains and thousands of crew members, it was extraordinary. Klaus Bergmann's letter in 1962 added another dimension. The man who laid the mines, intended to kill Allied sailors, learned that his minefield had been defeated by a lighthouse keeper with a foghorn. Bergmann's response was to acknowledge this publicly and express gladness that he lost that particular engagement. This is unusual. Military veterans rarely express gladness about losing. But Bergmann understood that the engagement had been between his desire to kill and Murphy's desire to save. When framed that way, Bergmann preferred to have lost. His letter was an acknowledgement that Murphy's method was superior, not because it was more sophisticated, but because its purpose was preservation rather than destruction. Murphy never knew about Bergmann's letter. He died 4 years before it was published. He never knew that the man who laid the minefield had acknowledged defeat. He never knew that his foghorn navigation would be studied by historians and filmmakers decades later. He just knew that one morning in September 1943, a convoy needed help, and he had knowledge that could help, and he shared it. That was enough. The recognition came later to an audience that didn't include Murphy. Sometimes that's how important work happens. Quietly, without recognition, by people who don't think what they're doing is particularly special. Because they've been doing it so long, it feels ordinary.
James Murphy guided 47 ships through a minefield in dense fog using a foghorn and 31 years of experience. To him, it was just another day at Cape Spear Lighthouse. To the thousands of men on those ships, it was the difference between life and death. Both things are true. Neither one makes the other less important.